Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 1st of March. In today's video, we're going to be covering the most important updates from the past couple of days that I've missed, including Ivanivske. We'll look west of Avdiivka, we'll look at Krasnohorivka, Novomykhailivka, and end with Robotyne. We'll begin by looking at Ivanivske, which is a critical part of the front line. I won't be able to get to every single part of the fronts just because there's been so many changes, but the areas that are most crucial I will focus on in detail, including the unit compositions. So let's do some of that over here in the Bakhmut sector, where a lot of these Russian operations directly to the west of the city have been led by VDV elements, such as the 98th and the 106th Airborne Divisions, and they've been aided by the newly formed 6th Motor Rifle Division, which is a part of the 3rd Army Corps formed in 2022. In terms of the specific assaults led around Ivanivske and Bodanivka at a regimental level, you've had the work of the 299th, the 11th Air Assault Brigade, and then also the 217th Airborne Regiment. And so they've been crucial in these assaults that overran Ukrainian forward defenses and are now trying to dislodge Ukrainians from Ivanivske. You've also had support from other units like the 102nd Regiment and the LPR's 4th Motorized Brigade, which has an artillery component that's been targeting the Ukrainians for a while now around Klishivka. And recently we've seen a lot of footage come out of Ivanivske of Russian bombardments. We've not seen that much footage of actual combat within the village, which makes it hard to give a solid mapping of where the Russians and Ukrainians alike are located. And there are a lot of differing reports as to which sections are under either side's control, so my map is not entirely accurate. What we do know is that over the past week, there's been a massive increase in Russian bombardments of the residential areas, which has made it more difficult for the Ukrainians to lodge their forces in larger numbers within the village, and that has further complicated the Ukrainian defense. At the same time, over the past 3 days, the Russian forces are reported to have advanced from the northeastern direction deeper and deeper into the residential sections. It's a bit of a debate as to whether the Russian forces are at the outskirts still or whether they've been able to advance even deeper and get control over the T-0504 road in certain sections and reach the southeastern outskirts. So that is still the fog of war. What we do know is that the Russian forces have also been targeting Ukrainian positions to the south. These positions are pretty well developed as the Ukrainians have been fortifying the southern flank of Avdiivka since last year during the Bakhmut campaign, where they had to defend against Russian assaults in this direction. There were some FPV strikes targeting Ukrainian forces, including their ammo crates and BTR-70s in these Ivanivske warehouses. But in terms of physical assaults, the Ukrainian defenders were able to repel those. There were several attempts by the Russians to advance along open fields using tanks and armored vehicles to advance along the southern flank to put Ivanivske into an even more precarious position by getting control of the heights overlooking the valley over there. But the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, which is the main Ukrainian unit defending in this direction, was able to repel these assaults with the help of the Signum drone units, which is attached to it. And so there were some FPV strikes and additional footage that was recently released of the targeting of the Russian infantry that dismounted in some of these tree lines by artillery. And so we know for now that the Ukrainians do have control of the southern flank, and the southern flank is extremely critical regardless of what happens in Ivanivske. Another thing that is still unclear is whether the Ukrainians are sending additional reinforcements from nearby areas such as Chasiv Yar or the eastern suburb of it to hold the line in Ivanivske, or whether the Ukrainians are conducting a fighting withdrawal where they have their forward elements holding onto the line, that would be the 93rd, and then other squads that are operating withdraw under the cover of this active defense. That is something that I don't know. I generally don't, because there's been conflicting reports from the Russian side mainly talking about this. So we're really going to have to wait and see. But at the same time, we do know that the Russians have increased their targeting of Ukrainian groupings that are generally to the east of the Donbass Canal, and that includes especially in this apartment complex area to the in the eastern section of Chasiv Yar. This is also a Russian target that they're looking at in the post-Ivanivske landscape, because this is Ukraine's only other large defensive node that is to the east of the Donbass Canal. There are several other villages, but this is definitely the most prized possession because it does include several apartment complexes and industrial facilities and other higher elevated areas that are overlooking the battlefield, which also do provide whoever controls that area a bridge to reach Chasiv Yar itself. And so the Russian forces are targeting the Ukrainians as they're crossing over towards the line of contact in that section, as is proven by these fabs that were dropped on those staging. The Russians are heavily invested in the capture of Ivanivske because capturing such a forward node would open up several new axes for Russian advances. One such attack could be from the north, where there are hills that the Ukrainians currently control. Some of these hills do contain trenches, and this area, as we talked about, would give them a vector to reach the southern flank of Avdiivka, for instance, and the suburbs of Chasiv Yar. To the south, there are heights that the Ukrainians currently control. These heights are critical because having control over them would give the Russians parity in terms of elevation in comparison to the Ukrainian positions that are located further westwards in the heights located around the Donbass Canal, an area like this, for instance. Because Ukraine's largest advantage on the sector of the front line is the fact that they have their heights that are overlooking the battlefield where the Russians are currently advancing. This can clearly be seen on the map where Chasiv Yar is located on a dominant heights, but the areas to the south of it are also on pretty high elevation, which is equal to the heights that are to the east of the Donbass Canal in the area marked in yellow, which the Russians are looking to occupy, as that would give them a bridge to then attack across the Donbass Canal and create a flanking maneuver for the city of Chasiv Yar itself, located over here. And you could say the same thing for the northern flank of Ivanivske. Those are, of course, long-term plans, but Russia would want to shape the battlefield in a way that would be conducive for future operations past the Donbass Canal, but also looking further south. Getting control of Ivanivske would cut off a key route through which Klishivka is supplied, and by getting control of the heights overlooking Klishivka, the Ukrainian garrison in that village would be in a precarious spot and could be forced to withdraw westwards. Now, looking to the west of Avdiivka, as a brief recap, when Avdiivka was captured by the Russian forces, the Ukrainians were still woefully behind in their construction of defenses in a unified manner in an area just to the west of the city. And so that created obvious problems as the Russian forces were still able to continue their offensive activities and actually expand them due to the ability to rotate troops, due to the fact that their garrison in the wider Avdiivka or Donetsk area amounts to 40 or 50,000 men. And so with that ability to rotate forces and with a lack of exhaustion, the Russian forces did not actually pause after the city was captured. And so the Ukrainian forces really did not have any time afterwards to continue building their defenses in these towns that are immediately to the west of it. Additionally, as we discussed in previous videos, building defenses here is still not conducive because all of these villages that the Ukrainians are currently trying to hold on to are located on valleys that are overlooked by Russian positions that are now in Avdiivka, but also generally around the Donetsk city area. The Russian forces do control massive ridges overlooking the Ukrainian forward. In the recent weeks, really the only silver lining for Ukraine has been the fact they've successfully rotated out the 110th Mechanized Brigade and replaced it with other units, including Azov, and now we're receiving reports of the 25th Airborne Brigade being moved in from other sections of the front line, like around the Luhansk front, I believe, and now they're going to be sent in to fill any gaps that were created by the casualties and the disarray that occurred in the Avdiivka withdrawal. And so based on everything I've described, I've not seen another example of the Russian forces continuing sustained offensive activities and yielding such large amount of gains, obviously in relative terms, since the operations in the town of Popasna. If you remember that, there was a pretty significant battle for that village like in May or April of 2022, And so the control of that village gave the Russians control over a massive ridge that then allowed them to expand their offensive activities, you could say, westwards, and that allowed them to get their first stepping stone towards the Bakhmut area, with forces then advancing towards an area like Pokrovske. And then further north, it gave them the opportunity to advance along roads that then reached areas to the further north, like around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which the Russian forces then pressured and started taking over in the late spring and summer of 2022. And so during that time period, you had a similar example of the Russian forces within several weeks expanding control through an area where the Ukrainians did not have that many prepared defensive lines. So let's go back to Avdiivka. But in any case, looking at the past few days, there is some ambiguity about some of these villages as to whether they are fully under Russian control or still need to be cleared. One such example is Tonenke, where it is universally agreed upon that the Russian forces do have a foothold in the village. And according to the mapping of Ukrainian sources like Deep States, the Russian forces have also gotten control over a lot of the open fields to the south of Tonenke, where there was significant Ukrainian resistance for months against the Russian offensive by the 53rd Mechanized Brigade. Now that unit has been forced to abandon many of its positions around Tonenke. There is also ambiguity as to whether the Ukrainians are still resisting in the northernmost parts of the village. And so I do apologize for not having the complete answer to that. There is not enough visual proof from this village to make a definitive statement either way. What we do know is that either way, the Russian forces are pushing and will likely capture the village in the coming days if they haven't already. And that's being done by the 1st Slavic Motor Rifle Brigade and the Territorial 1553rd Motor Rifle Regiment. What we do know is that the Russian forces, starting around the 26th of February, they expanded activities into the village from their node of attack in Severne and also from the northeast, starting in Lastochkine, where they were able to send armored vehicles and infantry through the open fields. And the Russian forces also were busy during this time period dropping fab bombs and shelling a lot of the Ukrainian squads that were trying to withdraw westwards past the bodies of water located in this section, which are an essential part of Ukraine's plans for trying to prolong the defense of some of these villages. Another area where the Russians advanced was Orlivka. The Ukrainians have completely abandoned Orlivka. That is not up for discussion. They withdrew westwards past the Dorna River, as you can call it. In some areas, it is extremely narrow and perhaps not even present and could be just physically crossed without any sort of bridge needed. And that is a big issue with trying to rely on a body of water like that is basically a stream in some sections as a solid defense line. But for the time being, the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to it as they try to construct additional lines several kilometers to the west. In regards to Orlivka, the Russian forces are either fully in control or are in the process of clearing out the westernmost parts of the village. And these operations are being conducted by the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, a DPR unit. It is visually confirmed that they have control over the southernmost section of the village, and there's a lot of photos of them. For instance, around the public library, there's footage of their assaults where they had several BMPs entering into Orlivka from roads starting in Lastochkine, and then dismounting infantry that stormed some of the residential buildings. And as the Ukrainians were retreating, there were again fab strikes on their positions in the roads and in the houses. And the general theme is that the Ukrainian squads that were able to make it out, and most of them were, they were able to either coalesce their forces around Semenivka or withdraw even further westwards to an area like Umanske. And the same could be said for an area like Berdichi. The thing about Berdichi is there are starkly opposing claims by both sides about this village, and it is very frustrating to sort of cover that with a lack of visual evidence. But the point is, some Russian sources have claimed that either the Ukrainians fully evacuated the village or that the Russians fully control it. And to the contrary, the Ukrainians claimed that they were able to repel Russian attacks in this direction. What we saw is that since the capture of Stepove, the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade has been empowered to conduct larger assaults further westwards now that they don't have the Ukrainians as a thorn in their back in Western Stepove, and the fact that they now have support, fire support, and reconnaissance support from the coke plants. Now they are sending infantry and also, BTRs, MTLBs along the dirt road into Berdichi. And so, in one such assault that it was claimed by the Ukrainians that to be on the 27th of February, there was a pretty significant Ukrainian response where the 47th Mechanized Brigade, they sent in their FPV drones. They coordinated in a counterattack with the help of some of the Bradleys in the section. And so they were able to successfully attack the Russian vehicles and the dismounted infantry that had made it into the eastern outskirts of the village and led to several killed, most of those being killed by FPV drones. And due to this initial attack being repelled, the Ukrainians did have time to organize their forces and build up defenses at the very least in the western section of the village where you have these various tree lines built. Now, what I don't know is that in the days since then, whether the Russian forces were successful in capturing the eastern section of the village. Russian sources do claim they were able to, and there is some footage which is also a bit ambiguous, which shows Russian vehicles attacking in Berdichi. And you could also see the destroyed Abrams that the Ukrainians sent to the front line in that still. And so it seems like this area at the moment is still a war zone. And it does make sense why the Ukrainians will be resisting in this area. They don't want to give the Russian forces an opportunity to flank Simonivka from the north, as the Russian forces already do have an opportunity to flank Simonivka from the south due to their capture of Orlivka. Because as you can see on the map, there are several routes past the Duvna River, as it's referred to cross over that river crossing and actually just assault Simonivka from the south. Because the Ukrainians, although they were unable to build a unified line of defense, they did build some fortifications in recent weeks and months around Simonivka, and it seems like it makes sense for them to build it in that area as it's past the body of water and it's near local heights that are located in this area to the west, but it is not nearly enough to last any sort of extended period of time. It is only a mechanism by which the Ukrainians could try to prolong the defense for several days or maybe a bit more while they prepare additional defenses in the several kilometers areas to the west, like in an area like Umanske or Novopokrovske. And then regarding Berdichi, again, as I said, you do have a pretty strong Ukrainian units with a lot of Western weaponry and experience from the counteroffensive, so they are trying to hold on to the northern flank. And again, the Ukrainians are trying to build a unified defense line somewhere in this sector in order to prevent the Russian forces from continuing their gains deeper into the Donetsk Oblast. And so there are several areas where they're trying to do that right now that are being theorized. And here's Clement Molin's map again, the fortification map. It's not complete in terms of all the mapping of Ukrainian defenses, but I do think it does a very thorough job. And it gives an idea of the areas where Ukraine has gaps that they have to try to deal with right now. One such area where the Ukrainians do actually have defenses is into the area to the east of Umanske. And so this is an area that in the immediate future, the Ukrainians are definitely going to try to hold on to. Because as you can see, in the areas to the south of Umanske, you have several very important defensive nodes that are connected to the front line, including Netalove and Pervomaiske, where the Ukrainians are currently resisting. And by losing an area like Umanske, including its fortifications, the Russian forces would have access to roads that are leading south and flanking the Ukrainians in Netalove and in an area like Pervomaiske, where they've been resisting Russian attacks for really several months now, since the beginning of the Avdiivka offensive. Now, looking at the area further west, you also have a lot of Ukrainian defenses that are being prepared in an area like Robotyne. And that makes a lot of sense because Robotyne is located on the dominant height in this region. It's also a logistical hub with a lot of roads and rail lines connecting over there. And it is on a hill, as I said before, so the Ukrainians are trying to hold onto that section. And downstream from Robotyne, there are several ridges located in the fields that are located to the west of the villages like Simonivka and Orlivka. And so right now there are not many defenses over there. But then again, the Ukrainians would hope to at least try to hold a line in this section for an extended period of time, even if they can't hold on to it permanently, at least as a means by which to buy time for even better defenses or even more well-developed defenses to be set up in an area further west, like around this section over here. And so generally, you could see that the key hallmarks of this defense include the rail line, because the rail line is located on a height. There are hills that are running along it, and so the Ukrainians need this for a good viewing position of the advancing Russian forces and as a firing point onto them if they're going to be sending in larger amounts of infantry and fighting vehicles through this area. And then further south, as we talked about, there are the heights that I'll mark in red, for instance. And then even further west in the area where the Ukrainians actually do have defenses built on the rear at the moment, it is located in a valley, so that is a disadvantage for the Ukrainians. The advantage is the fact that the Ukrainian defenses over here are protected by a larger body of water. Not, it is wider than the Duvna River. It's called the Avdiivka River, and so that area is definitely being prepared as a fallback line at some point in time. And if we're looking at the consequences of this from a broader perspective of the battlefield, I'll go back to my map. At the moment, if you measure it, the Russian forces at most have been able to advance about 15 kilometers westwards, you would say 14, and this has put off a massive amount of pressure that was being put onto the Russian groupings in Donetsk. There are a massive amount of military installations and logistical hubs that were being shelled by the Ukrainians in the city. You also have industrial facilities that were being targeted. And now, due to this push, which has really allowed the Russians to take over a lot of the forward batteries where they were stationed, a lot of the 155 millimeter shorter range howitzers were stationed in these towns like Tonenke that were firing onto Donetsk city and onto the railway junction. Now they don't have those positions anymore. And again, they can't be stationed immediately at the front line. They have to be stationed in an area several kilometers, maybe up to 10 kilometers to the west. And so that decreases the range of their artillery even more. It makes it even more difficult for the Ukrainians to target the logistics of the Russian forces in this direction. And if the Russians continue to expand and continue to put pressure on the Ukrainian forces, which forces them to their worst case fallback line around the Ivanivske River, I believe it's called, over here, then that would be another 10 kilometers to the west. That would mean the Russian forces were able to advance around 24 kilometers. And this would also put some of the pressure off of Avdiivka. It would allow Avdiivka to become a forward operating hub for Russian logistics. And so I don't want to turn this into a longer term outlook on the video, but just in general in terms of the significance of the Russian operations that have occurred around Avdiivka. You could say in the very, very long term, I don't want people to think it's immediate, but in the very, very long term, this axis of attack that the Russians have developed, even if the current offensive does eventually run out of steam, in future offensive activities, they will be able to use these newly acquired positions to flank cities like Toretsk that are on the front line, or to approach villages at least within the range of closer range artillery systems or other sort of fire towards an area like Pokrovsk, which is an extremely important village in Donetsk or city, which has a bunch of roads that are meeting through it, a lot of artillery batteries stationed over there, massive logistical and command hub. And right now, due to the Avdiivka offensive, the Russian forces are in the process of getting closer to a lot of these longer term targets. And in stark contrast, when looking at a shorter term target, that would be Novelske. Novelske is a forward operating node for Ukrainians on the line of contact in Donetsk, which prevents the Russian forces from developing their attacks to flank an area like Krasnohorivka or Natalove. And so that's why you have the 59th Moraz Brigade resisting so much in this sector. But nonetheless, the Russian forces were able to advance several hundred meters to the west from their current positions, and they're now on the southern outskirts of the village as they prepare to find ways to dislodge the fierce Ukrainian defense. Another area that I talked about and said it would be very likely that the Russian forces would assault is Krasnohorivka, and that is now turning out to be the case. Krasnohorivka, again, a even much larger forward operating node for the Ukrainians. near the what you could call salient of Marinka, the salient that has developed over the past 2 years, which is allowing the Russian forces to penetrate deeper and deeper into the supply routes and into the strategic depth of the Ukrainian defenses in Donetsk Oblast. And so what we're seeing is Krasnohorivka is presenting the Ukrainians with an opportunity to sort of slow down those Russian advances. And so now the Russians are trying to dislodge the Ukrainians from this direction. They're doing so from the south. First of all, the Russian forces solidified control of the Trotovska coal mine, and they spent the past week increasing the amount of FAB airstrikes, FPV strikes, artillery shelling, and ATGM fire onto Ukrainian forces in the city, especially around the industrial section and around the apartment buildings in the east. And after that preparation, there was an assault that was launched by the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade of the DPR. They advanced along this particular road, and that was mainly infantry advancing along this road. And then you had the armored vehicles advancing through this field in this sort of semicircle maneuver. And then they entered the actual southern portion of the residential areas and engaged in firefights with the Ukrainian defenders, largely from the 80th Air Assault Brigade, its 2nd Battalion specifically. And so the Russian forces were able to gain a foothold in the southern outskirts. As to the specific sections where they control, that is up for debate because it's now being claimed by Ukrainian sources that they were able to counterattack and repel the Russian advances. There's actually footage released by the Azov Brigade, which is now actually fighting in Krasnohorivka as well. They released footage of close quarters combat in Krasnohorivka in the southern section against the Russian infantry in their attacks, and they claim to fully repel the Russian advances. And recently there's been new footage released of assaults that have occurred along this axis to the west of the road, where you had tanks advancing and entering the residential areas directly, providing fire support for Russian infantry. And so this area is likely a gray zone, and it will be important to see whether the Ukrainians could maintain their current front line in the southern part of the city, or whether the Russians gain a foothold that will allow them to penetrate even deeper into the city. Around Pobieda, there's new reports coming from Rybar about an attempted Ukrainian counterattack by the 33rd Mechanist Brigade. We don't have the full details on this attack, but for a while now, Deep State has reported that the southern parts of the village are a gray zone because the Ukrainians are continuously trying to counterattack, and that makes a lot of sense when you think of it from the Ukrainian perspective, because Pobieda, again, is a forward base for the Russian forces to advance southwards and attack the line of villages that is directly to the west of Novomykhailivka. But regardless of that, if we look at Novomykhailivka, the Russian forces have had success over here recently. The Russian forces, specifically from the 155th Marine Brigade, they recently, on the 27th of February, launched a new assault that was largely infantry-based, advancing along some of these tree lines, using them as concealment to try to inch closer and closer to the Ukrainian defenses, including trenches in the southern outskirts of the village. And so they were spotted by the 79th Air Assault Brigade, including their artillery and FPVs. And so there was some cluster munitions shelling of the Russian infantry and of some of their vehicles. A lot of the vehicles that are shown in the footage, they were abandoned several months ago, so it's not new Russian losses. But either way, you get an idea of the fierce Ukrainian resistance. In any case, in the subsequent days, the Russian forces were successful, and they were able to penetrate the Ukrainian line, push them back, and take over the cemetery area and the warehouses, where the Ukrainians had several weeks to fortify defenses, but they were unsuccessful. Now the Ukrainians, they have concentrated their forces within the central part of Avdiivka or Novomykhailivka and in the northern warehouses, as now the Russian forces control the southern outskirts and the easternmost parts of the residential section. And this last update is an addendum to my previous parts or previous snippets of other videos where I discussed Robotyne, because we discussed in depth the battles that were waged by the Russian side to try to capture parts of the village that eventually led to Ukrainian counterattacks. And since then, the Ukrainians have actually expanded their assaults to retake additional portions of land, including trenches that the Russian forces had taken back in their campaign starting in mid-February. And so now it's being reported by the pro-Russian side by some Russian affiliated sources that the Ukrainians were actually able to get control over sections of the trenches located to the north of Novomykhailivka. Again, let me remind you, these trenches are important because they overlook much of the battlefield, including fields, including parts of Robotyne and supply lines, including Novomykhailivka. And so now the Ukrainians, they have displayed their ability to continue to hold the line and actually counterattack, even though for a certain period in time their line was breached by the Russian side. For the time being, they could still resist, and I'm talking specifically about the 65th Mechanized Brigade and National Guard units. So I am very interested to see how the Russian forces counter this, whether they continue to put pressure on the flanks or whether the intensity of assaults dies down for the time being. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.